we have the wonderful, wonderful Adam Johnson. He is a media critic. He is the co-host of the Citations Needed podcast. He's written for all sorts of fancy places, but you can find his writing now at his Substack, which is The Column. So that's thecolumn.substack.com. And make sure you follow him on Twitter at Adam Johnson NYC, because he's great at that. So without any further ado, bringing on to the show, Adam Johnson. Welcome, Adam.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good, you?
I'm doing well.
Great.
Just chilling in Cedar Rapids,
Nice. With Hill?
otherwise known as Chicago.
Nice. Not with Hillary, though.
So I do want to do one disclaimer for your viewers that this was also true of my live show last week. My glasses have been in the shop for a while, so I'll be doing a lot of squinting. It's not a blue steel thing. That's good. I can't see well.
Guys, don't be confused. It's not, contrary to popular belief, Adam's blue steel face.
Yes, it's not.
It's just an eyesight issue.
I swear I'm getting glasses soon.
Yeah. You write about the way that politicians and the media, which enables them, hide their attacks on the homeless behind something you call squishy euphemisms media use to make liberals feel good about criminalizing homelessness.
I wrote about what I saw as sort of an increasingly vague euphemisms for specifically Eric Adams, but also in Washington, D.C. and Chicago and other places. You have a basic contradiction, which is that you have these liberals in major cities who obviously are going to be Democrats. Almost all major cities like Democrats, who have to play this double game where they ostensibly are progressive or liberal or kind of check the box, but they also need to carry out the desires of real estate, who largely fund mayoral campaigns for these Democrats. And if there's one thing real estate hates more than anything, it's homeless people, and specifically homeless people in proximity to wealthy neighborhoods or tourist areas. And so this contradiction has to be reconciled with language. And increasingly, you see this kind of language. For example,
I'll bring them in. Here are some of the examples, like just so you to have in front of you. You want me to scroll through some of them? So we got interactions, mental health interventions.
So
I'll just let me do an overview so you're so everyone knows. Then you can go back and focus on them. Is that cool?
That sounds good.
All right, so we got
focus because I'm squinting. Yes.
Right.
So no glasses, no computer. It's all
this is Adam Johnson unplugged. We like this. This is very Katie Halper show. People like the kind of behind the scenes. So all right, interactions, mental health interventions. These are all the words, the phrases they use. Solving the homelessness crisis versus solving the homelessness crisis. And vague, unenforceable promises of housing that are never followed up on. So those are some of them that you lay out.
Well, interactions is a term that's used a lot. Eric Adams likes to use it. It's basically, the NYPD does the vast majority of the interactions that usually lead to summons, ticketing, or just forced expulsion from public spaces. But that sounds bad. So they say interactions. It sort of gives the impression that it's a social worker with a clipboard. Now, sometimes they'll have a token social worker present, but mostly this is being done by the NYPD. Everybody knows that. So saying we're sending a bunch of cops to purge homeless people from public spaces sounds bad. So we say, we're doing social and mental health interactions or interventions. Sort of sounds better, right? Despite that being a fraction of what's actually taking place. We know that based on the city's own data. So this leads to another one that's popular increasingly, which is sort of these very vague promises of shelter or housing. And so in Washington, D.C., there was a poll that said more than half of Washington, D.C. residents support cleaning up the camps. They love to say cleaning up the camps because it makes humans look like refuse, right? Look like garbage shit, basically, even though these are people that are being moved, not camps or not trash, right? But if you actually look at the poll, it was a PPP poll. If you look at the actual details of the poll, it says over 50% of people support removing camps if everyone's fine, if quote unquote most people are given alternative housing. This vague term is really, really important because that's really where the rubber hits the road in terms of the humanity and the ethics of removing people from these camps, right? Of course, based on the mayor's own data, or the DC Health and Human Services equivalent, less than 50% were actually placed in housing of any kind, and that was based on their own data. So the number's probably lower. In the case of New York, Only 2%, based on the mayor's own data, Mayor Eric Adams' own data, less than 2% actually go into these shelters. And the reason is because these shelters are, and any homeless activist will tell you this, they're very dangerous. They're very crowded. There's a lot of COVID infections. They usually have rats, insects, mildew, mold. Um, the vast majority of homeless would prefer to live on the streets than live in shelters, which should tell you something about the shelters, since the streets are so dangerous themselves. There oftentimes there's strict austerity rules regarding drug usage. Obviously, many homeless people will have substance abuse issues. There's a lot of austerity. Families are divided. You can't be with your partner. You can't be with your pet. So the vast majority of homeless will choose, in the face of these, and it's also very temporary. You could be kicked out at any moment. It's not a permanent solution. Um, and Eric Adams knows this. So when he says, "I'm going to clean out this camp," and we're gonna work to find them shelter, we all know it's bullshit, because 98% of them won't go to the shelter, and 99.5%, probably 90, closer to 99.7, depending on how you look at the numbers, are not given alternative housing. And so that sounds bad, right? If I'm saying I'm virtually, which is basically 100%, right? If Eric Adams says, "I'm going to take 100% of these homeless encampments and just take all their shit, take their tents, throw them in a dumpster, and give them, 5 minutes to gather up all their belongings before I throw it all in a landfill in Staten Island," that sounds bad. And so there's this vague promise of shelter that never really comes. And this is something homeless activists have been dealing with in many cities. This is obviously this is not unique to New York. To do a tongue twister, and increasingly, people are calling bullshit on this. And De Blasio did this too. You got to remember, De Blasio did camp sweepments without shelter during his regime quite often, especially the last year. Um, and Eric Adams, of course, was largely, he received more real estate funding than anyone. He received the backing of the New York Post. He openly solicited police officer union endorsements, although he did not get them. I think he later got them. He outspent his opponents, or outraised his opponents, by millions of dollars, largely on the backs of real estate. And that's what he was elected to do. He was elected to execute the needs of real estate, who basically runs the major politics in New York. Now there are people on the assembly or city council who aren't bought and sold by real estate, but for the most part, they pretty much run the show. And so that's what he was doing. But again, within a city that prides itself on being liberal or being progressive, that sounds bad. So you come up with these terms like, "Oh, we're gonna try to move them in the shelter." And I also wrote a piece saying nobody's going to follow up on that.
Yeah, so that's another one I
Um,
want to bring. I want to bring that up, and I want to make sure that people could see this, because you write a piece where you kind of make a prediction and offer a challenge. So you write, "Not a single reporter will follow up on Eric Adams' vague promise of placing purge homeless in healthy living conditions. A
right.
challenge to New York media to, for once, hold electeds accountable for vague promises concerning alleged housing for the unhoused." And
Yeah.
you
And De
go
Blasio did
through,
this too.
and you
So I
can't
want to
make
be
this up,
clear.
by the way. He made this announcement up. He made the announcement about another crackdown on the city's homeless population. He made this announcement at an APAC real estate luncheon.
An APAC real estate luncheon, which is, yeah. Um,
It's like, if
is a
I read
is
this
a
in a
real estate
script, I'd say it was
luncheon
over
for
the top.
it's a real estate. It's a real estate lobbying group they also a pros role group. So
Right. Couldn't have
this
happened to a
is
nicer group of
it's a
lobbyists.
very warm and fuzzy setting for the dispossessed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They really
And
know a lot about taking people's homes away.
so yeah. So anyway, so he said he, quote, promised to move them into, quote, healthy living conditions, which doesn't mean anything, because he thinks the shelters are healthy living conditions. They're not, and also there's not enough shelters in New York City, even if they wanted to have them. So he also chose to do this on a day that was 23 degrees and freezing in New York City. He could have waited 2 days until the temperature is supposed to be in the high 60s, low 70s, but they chose to do it for during cold weather, as they did with the subway purges a few weeks ago, and those are still ongoing. They choose to do it during cold weather because the goal is not to transition homeless people into housing. The goal is to jail and harass them until they either, well, to put it crudely, die, or go to jail, or I think probably more generously, till they basically get harassed into leaving New York City. So there are various cities who will, and especially in California and Florida, who will give bus tickets to homeless people to basically just leave. They don't want them. And that's the general approach to homelessness that a lot of these big cities take, which is just get them out of my way, get them out of sight. I don't want to see it. What happens to them, I don't. It's fuck all to me. It's not really my problem. There'll be some housing. You know, New York does have housing, but it doesn't come close to meeting the demand. And of course, there's scientific study after scientific study after scientific study that will show you that homelessness correlates heavily with with housing prices, despite the myth that all the homeless people in California are from Nebraska and all the homeless people from New York are from Michigan. They always start to think, oh, they're coming from out of town, blah blah blah. But it heavily correlates with local housing prices, and so the instead of coming up with ways of having real robust social welfare systems of free housing, housing as a human right, which is to say a system whereby if there is where everyone is entitled to a house by law, and if the government somehow doesn't provide one, that's a violation of your basic human rights. These are things that homeless advocates have been fighting for, especially in this kind of quote unquote post COVID austerity regime. Those are completely out of the question. We now have to, and that's basically what Eric Adams was elected to do, which is to kind of enforce a post COVID austerity regime. That real estate prices have skyrocketed, rents have gone up considerably. The average home price is up 23% compared to last year, which means rents are up. Typically, not always, but typically in relation to that. So you have this huge housing crisis, which has only gotten worse. Again, quote unquote, post COVID. And that's what people like Eric Adams and these kind of big city mayors are there to enforce. They're there to enforce the needs of capital, which finds the homeless population to be incredibly inconvenient. And there's a surplus, unwanted population which must be dealt with largely through carceral means, largely through ticketing and summoning. Eric Adams' own data shows thousands of tickets, thousands of hundreds of arrests in the time period for petty infractions. There's been hundreds of arrests for people spreading out on the subway, which is to say sleeping on the subway. And again, these people have to go to court. They have to pay fines. Oftentimes they'll have to spend several days in jail. And this is the primary mechanism with which we quote unquote solve the homelessness problem, which is one of the other euphemisms I talk about, which is the vague when a politician stands up and says we have to solve the homelessness crisis. Different people hear different things, right? A leftist says, oh well, we're going to provide housing. A liberal hears sort of what they want to hear. They hear, well, I just kind of want it out of the way, right? And then the conservative says, oh, we're going to send in the police to go crack some skulls because I don't really give a shit. Moral failing, they needed to work harder, et cetera, et cetera. And whenever a politician says we're going to solve or fix the homeless crisis, it's incumbent upon media to ask, well, what the fuck does that mean? What specifically, forget my language there, what specifically are you going to do to actually, quote unquote, fix the problem? The analogy I use, it's sort of like the ways in which Davos talks about inequality or the military talks about climate change. These are problems to them in quotation marks. These are not things they want to solve. They're potential crises to be mitigated, managed, and militarized. And so when Davos talks about inequality, right, when a bunch of billionaires get together and talk about inequality, they don't talk about it the way you and I talk about it, as a kind of moral rot to be solved. They talk about it as a potential vector of a threat, just as you would look at terrorism or loose nukes, right? Just the same when the military talks about climate change, they're not talking about cutting the carbon footprint of the U.S. empire by 50% by X year. So by moving bases and reducing its number of F-35 jets, which burn up more jets, which burn up more carbon in one trip than 10,000 cars do. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about pumping in more money to the military to shore up the military bases, and they'll throw a green drone here and there, but mostly they don't give a shit. And so just the same when these politicians talk about fixing homelessness, they're not talking about it in a sort of humanist Victor Hugo way. They're talking about it in a jackbooted way, and we have to be clear about that. And that's ultimately what ends up happening. Just because they send they just send 5,000 NYPD officers to go quote unquote clean up encampments, and they send a handful of social workers with them, does not make it non-carceral, does not make it law enforcement. And that's ultimately what the cities are increasingly turning to. And of course, they've been doing this for decades. This is not necessarily new, but I think with the current housing crisis and the current homelessness crisis, which is the same thing, they're both housing crises, right? that increasingly that this kind of police intervention is what we're getting. And you have a bunch of PR people who sit around these liberal city, with city officials and these parallel NGOs, and they have to whiteboard various ways of making it sound like they're not just purging homeless people. And so, as a media critic, it's a little bit there's a lot there. There's a lot of meat on the bone in terms of bullshit. Not to mix metaphors.
Yeah, that's an unfortunate mixed metaphor, but it actually works. One phrase that you refer to that Eric Adams said was, "You can't put a band-aid on a cancerous sore. That is not how you solve the problem. You must remove the cancer and start the healing process." And you wrote, Adam, "Here Adams casually refers to the unhoused as a cancer, but is he calling them a cancer on New York, or is he calling the fact of homelessness a cancer?" So there's a lot of kind of disgusting manipulative language. And then when Adams announced his more recent quote unquote cleanup, he said, "We can't stop an individual from sleeping on the street based on law, and we're not going to violate that law. But you can't build a miniature house made out of cardboard on the streets. That's inhumane." And of course, you wonder, Adam,
Well,
what?
that's an incredibly shocking statement. I mean, it's not the existence of homeless people that's inhumane. It's them building shelter that he views as inhumane. Because again, he has to throw out this kind of vaguely progressive language. But the thing with Adams is he doesn't even make any sense because he sort of doesn't care. He's very clear about who he's pandering to, and a lot of the liberalese is kind of tacked on. It doesn't really come. He's not. It doesn't really come from any kind of. It's not from the gut. It's kind of
Yeah.
he knows he has to have certain buzzwords in there, but he's not saying it's inhumane we have homeless people. He's saying it's inhumane that homeless people build shelter on a night where it's again that particular night I think it had dropped to 18 degrees. That he doesn't because again they're not housing these people. They're not putting them in shelters. 98% are not going anywhere. They're just losing their shelter, their
Right.
temporary shelter that they built for themselves. That's gone. That's been thrown into a dumpster. But they're not being housed anywhere. So they're still the inhumanity is still there. They're still homeless. They still don't have a home. All that's been
Right.
achieved is their possessions have been destroyed and they've been harassed because they want them to get the fuck out. Sorry, they want them to leave New York.
Yeah. You write your piece. You end it by saying, "So this post is both a prediction and a challenge to New York media. In 6 weeks, follow up on the mayor's vague claim that the city will provide, quote, healthy living conditions, end quote, to those the administration and NYPD remove from public spaces. What percent of those cleaned up from the streets received these living conditions? Where do they end up? How many were simply arrested and jailed? I predict that no one in New York media will actually do this, and this rhetorical scam where pro-police liberal mayors get to couch cruel policies and public health ease by doing PR-driven box checking about social services, mental health, and healthy living conditions will continue right on schedule. These vague claims will never be followed up on, quantified, or verified by anyone other than the activists and directly impacted people fighting these policies. The actual policy of simply displacing New York's homeless population without providing sufficient and meaningful houses and hoping to arrest and harass them from place to place until they leave city limits will march on without any real pushback from any press outlets." So that's your chance, media.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm trying to like neg them into doing something, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm hoping the prediction's wrong. It very well may be wrong.
Well, if it's wrong, we're going to know why it's wrong because of your call
But
to action,
that's
and you
that's
got
the, well, that's
and you
that's
got the
not
Katie Halper show bump. So you
that's
put those
that's not
things
necessarily
together.
true. But yeah, part of your goal as a media critic is to like give achievable, actionable things that you feel like they could do.
Right.
Which is to say, like for once, because I mean this happens all the time. It's just this article was born from frustration. It just happened in DC. It's happened in San Francisco. That there's very little follow up on these claims of housing, even though that's so essential to how it's sold.
Right.
And I think it's born from frustration that there just isn't really follow up, because you would think the next time they make the same claims, there would be, well, last time they said. I mean, they should have front loaded these articles with the city's own numbers from the recent subway purge weeks prior, which showed less than 2% were placed in housing. So this is a new purge of encampments versus subway, but we have less than 2% there. What reason would we have to believe this would be any better, if not worse?
Right.
And so, and I guess the whole thing is just a tacit indictment on the shelter system of New York, which again has many complaints of mildew, insects, rat infestations. The Daily News and New York Post both had articles recently about this. I mean, they're less safe than living under an underpass, which should tell you something.
Right. That's very disturbing. The cherry on top is that Eric Adams appeared at a launch event for a new Wells Fargo credit card product shortly after announcing this cleanup. So
Right. So he was
Night before last,
hanging out
right?
at a Wells Fargo party while he was evicting homeless people from their
Yeah.
from their domiciles.